A teacher in rural New South Wales stopped mid-sentence when one of her students said something no adult should ever hear. He was 8 years old, smiling, and he said, "My uncle's baby is in Mum's tummy." That single sentence, spoken without fear, without shame, was the first crack in a secret Australia had ignored for generations. Within months, investigators would uncover a hidden valley, a family living completely outside the world's rules, and a bloodline collapsing under its own silence. How could an entire bloodline disappear from society for generations and no one notice? Tonight we're uncovering the truth behind the Colt family, a story of isolation, silence, and the collapse of everything that defines family itself. Before we begin, subscribe to X Archives and turn on notifications, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Because what you're about to see is not history's rumor. It's what happens when isolation becomes inheritance. It began in an ordinary classroom in rural New South Wales, the kind of place where mornings smelled like chalk dust and eucalyptus, where the biggest disruption was usually a broken pencil. But one morning, a child said something no teacher is ever prepared to hear. He was 8 years old, barefoot, smiling. While the others worked on their spelling lists, he spoke in the same easy tone children use when talking about pets or birthdays. He said, "My uncle's baby is in Mum's tummy." At first, the teacher didn't react. Children mixed up family words all the time. Maybe he meant cousin. Maybe he was confused. But something in his voice stopped her. He wasn't uncertain. He was proud. She crouched beside his desk and asked gently, "Sweetheart, what did you say?" He looked up bright-eyed. "Uncle Bobby's baby. He sleeps in Mum's room. He says I'll be the brother soon." The classroom went quiet. The other students stared at their papers, unsure why their teacher's face had changed. She managed a thin smile and told them to keep working, but inside, her mind was already racing. At recess, she walked straight to the principal's office. Her hands shook as she poured a cup of water she didn't drink. "One of the kids said something strange," she said quietly. "About an uncle, a baby, and his mum." The principal looked up. "You think it's serious?" She nodded. "I think we need to report it." That afternoon, she wrote the official incident report, every word exact, no assumptions, no emotion. Later, when she called the child protection hotline, the operator paused halfway through her account. "You're sure that's what he said?" "Word for word," she replied. "He didn't sound scared, just normal." The operator's voice lowered. "We'll escalate it immediately." Within 48 hours, 2 welfare officers were assigned to investigate. The address the school provided was little more than a coordinate, a forgotten pocket of bushland outside Yass. When investigators interviewed the teacher later, she repeated her story carefully, though her voice trembled at the end. "He didn't even know it was wrong," she said. "That's what stayed with me. He wasn't hiding it." The first welfare report created from her call became Case 12-47. Under the boy's name, the teacher had written a short note in the margin. Just 3 words: unclear family structure. No one realized what that note would set in motion, how it would lead to a valley untouched by law, a family living by its own rules, and a secret that had waited generations to be found. That line in her report was the beginning of the end. The road ended miles before the map said it should. Beyond that point, there was nothing, just dry bushland, twisted trees, and the hum of silence that felt too deliberate. Senior Constable Harris switched off the engine and listened to the radio fade into static. "Signal's dead," he said, tapping the receiver. The 2 welfare officers in the back exchanged a glance. They continued on foot, following a faint track through the scrub. Dust clung to their boots, the sun already rising behind them. There were no fences, no signs, just a long stretch of emptiness. After nearly an hour, the smell of smoke reached them, faint but distinct, mixed with something sour underneath. One of the officers covered her nose. "It smells like ash and milk," she said quietly. A few steps later, the trees opened up, and they saw it. Sheets of corrugated iron, old tarps and shacks pieced together with rope and timber. It looked abandoned at first, until they noticed the faces watching. A small boy stood near the edge of a shelter, barefoot, motionless. Behind him, more faces appeared, pale, thin, and silent. None of them spoke. None of them blinked. Harris raised his hand. "Police," he said gently. "We're not here to hurt anyone." The boy didn't answer. He turned his head slightly, and a woman stepped out from behind the structure. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, her hair matted and gray. She stared at Harris for a moment, then said flatly, "We don't need help." He nodded once. "We just want to make sure the children are all right." "They're fine," she said. "They have me." Her voice was calm, steady, and final. Inside the shelters, the officers found makeshift beds, pots filled with rainwater, and scraps of food that had long gone stale. Drawings were scratched into wooden boards, stick figures, fires, animals, but no houses, no cars, no towns. One of the welfare officers wrote later, "The silence was complete. No sound of play, no conversation, just the weight of watching." When Harris asked how many people lived there, the woman hesitated. "All of us," she said. "We've always been here." By the time the team finished counting, they'd recorded 38 people, children, adults and elders, all sharing the same surname, though none could produce a single record of who they were. The initial site report read, "No utilities, no sanitation, multiple generations present, family hierarchy unclear." As they turned to leave, the children followed them with their eyes. Not a single one spoke. Back at the vehicle, Harris made his final note before starting the engine. "Silence appears conditioned, not natural." When they stepped onto that soil, they thought they'd found peace. But the silence wasn't peace, it was something taught. The first step after the welfare raid was paperwork, but there wasn't any. Every agency contacted came back with the same answer: nothing. No birth certificates, no Medicare numbers, no school enrollments, no hospital records. The name Colt returned blank across every database. Internal welfare summary. Case 1247. Scripted as status. Subjects unregistered. Identification unobtainable. Potential use of aliases. A clerk from Vital Records called the field office that morning. "I've checked every spelling," she said. "Colt, Colt, Colton, there's no one. It's like they don't exist." Across the room, an investigator rubbed his forehead, scanning a list of names written on a whiteboard. "How do you hide 40 people for decades?" The question hung in the air. No one answered. Within days, state departments began comparing data: education, health, taxation, social services. Every search led to the same dead end. The family had never enrolled, never worked, never claimed benefits. They had no digital shadow, no medical history, not even a vaccination record. A social worker who'd been assigned to the youngest children noticed something strange when documenting surnames. "Half of them don't know what to write," she said. "Some say Colt, some say Colt, a few say something that sounds like Colton. It's deliberate, like someone taught them to keep changing it." Investigators mapped the names anyway, linking each variant to a known family member. Within a week, the chart looked like a maze. Lines overlapped, circled back, disappeared. Agency note by cross-department inquiry read as observation. Multiple surnames connected to same lineage. Possible identity fragmentation to avoid detection. Rumors began to spread through nearby towns. Locals called them the Valley People, a nickname whispered in shops and post offices. "They kept to themselves," one man said. "We'd see smoke out that way some nights, thought it was campers." Another added, "You'd hear kids sometimes, but no one ever saw them in town. We just figured they moved on." Back in the city, welfare officers sat in a cramped meeting room surrounded by empty folders. One opened a fresh file, placed a blank form inside, and stared at it for a long moment. "This is all we've got," she said quietly. Her supervisor nodded. "Then we start with nothing." The next step was to establish who belonged to whom. That proved harder than finding their names. 3 generations appeared to live under one roof, grandparents, parents, and children sharing the same last name, or none at all. When questioned, most couldn't say who their fathers were. One welfare officer wrote in her notes, "Family structure indeterminate. Maternal lines dominant, patriarchal presence absent or concealed." It was as if the family had designed its own system, an underground network of new births and shifting identities, keeping every trace of itself off record. By the time government analysts compiled their first report, they'd confirmed the unthinkable. 5 decades of complete invisibility. No census entries, no tax filings, no deaths registered. The lead investigator closed the file, pressing his thumb against the empty cover. "Every file on the Colt family," he said quietly, "begins the same way." He flipped it open to the first page, but it was completely blank. At the center of the Colt family stood one woman, Betty Colt. Calm, composed, and always in control. Her authority didn't need shouting or violence. It lived in her tone, her timing, and the way she made obedience feel like devotion. Each morning began the same way. Betty called every name in order, children, grandchildren, even the adults she still referred to as my boys. Anyone slow to answer lost breakfast. When food was rationed, she decided who ate and when. During what she called quiet hours, no one was allowed to speak. If a child laughed too loudly, the punishment was isolation. Field interview, welfare officer note read as observation. Family operated under a strict internal code. Obedience enforced through ritual, not force. Matriarchal figure, Betty, commands absolute deference. When investigators first questioned her, she smiled politely, folding her hands in her lap. "We look after our own," she said. "Always have." She spoke softly, but every word was deliberate. There was no aggression, only certainty. To her, the family's isolation wasn't neglect, it was protection. "They wouldn't survive out there," she explained. "The world's poison. The air, the people, the rules, they make you forget who you are." Her beliefs mixed fragments of religion, myth, and something personal. She talked about purity, about keeping the blood clean. One officer noted that she used the phrase "our kind" more than a dozen times in a single interview. When asked who made the rules, Betty didn't hesitate. "They come from me," she said simply, "and from the ones before me." Her authority had been passed down like inheritance. She set curfews, controlled access to food, and decided who could sleep where. Even affection was rationed. If a child wanted comfort, they had to earn it through obedience. A social worker described the way her presence changed the room. When she walked in, everything stopped, the report read. The children's eyes went straight to her. They waited for her permission to breathe. Betty never raised her voice. She didn't need to. A look was enough to silence a child mid-sentence. When an officer once suggested the children might attend school, she smiled faintly and said, "They already learn everything they need from me." In later psychiatric evaluations, doctors described her mindset as moral inversion, a complete rewriting of right and wrong to serve control. She believed isolation was safety, obedience was love, and loyalty was truth. Even in custody, her tone never wavered. "You think you're saving them," she told one investigator. "But they'll come back. The world doesn't want them like I do." Her words weren't shouted. They were spoken with the calm assurance of someone who saw herself as the victim, not the cause. Betty Colt ruled her family through belief, not fear. Every rule she made was framed as care. Every act of control disguised as love. She didn't need chains. Her commandments were enough. The DNA samples arrived at the Sydney laboratory sealed in brown envelopes, each marked only by a number, C1 through C38. No names, no photos, no context. Just a note from the welfare department requesting urgent analysis. At first, the team assumed it was a routine paternity case. But within hours, the data began to unravel that idea completely. Dr. Elaine Morris, the senior geneticist, leaned over the first chart. "That can't be right," she said. "Run it again." The technician recalibrated the machine and waited. The results didn't change. Every genetic profile looked disturbingly similar, markers repeating where they shouldn't, sequences that should have varied but didn't. "They're almost identical," the technician said quietly. Dr. Morris frowned. "No, they're not identical. They're folded." Internal lab memo, preliminary findings observation read as, "Extensive runs of homozygosity detected across all samples. Consistent with multi-generational inbreeding. Recommend extended kinship mapping." For 3 days, the team reconstructed the family structure from the data. Each new line on the chart circled back on itself. Children whose parents were siblings, mothers who were also daughters, uncles who were fathers. The diagram stopped looking like a tree and began to resemble a web. Tight and circular, one researcher stared at the printout and said, "This isn't a family, it's a loop." By the end of the week, they had enough information to confirm what had been whispered by investigators in the field. The Colt bloodline had been collapsing in on itself for decades. Report excerpt. By Department of Health. Genetic Services Unit read, Summary. 5 consecutive generations of intrafamilial unions identified. Estimated inception, 1960s. Likely origin referred to internally as first camp. Dr. Morris reviewed every sample herself before signing the report. Each generation is a copy of the one before, she said. The genome has nowhere left to go. One junior analyst, new to the department, asked how that was even possible in modern Australia. Morris didn't look up from the microscope when she answered. Isolation, denial, and a belief system that made it all seem right. The report's conclusion was blunt. Genetic indicators show a closed population with no external input for approximately 5 generations. Consequences include developmental disorders, physical deformities, and cognitive impairment consistent with extreme consanguinity. When the findings were sent to Child Welfare Headquarters, the reaction was disbelief. A senior officer reread the final line twice before setting it down. 5 generations, she said. That's not neglect. That's a civilization collapsing. Back in the lab, Dr. Morris stood over the completed chart, a circular diagram of intersecting lines and codes, every connection leading back to itself. She pressed her marker to the center and drew a single dot. The family tree, she said softly, has no branches, only circles. The first interviews with the Colt children began 3 days after the rescue. They were held in a quiet room inside a regional care facility with paper, crayons, and soft lighting. The goal was to make the children feel safe, but nothing about their behavior fit any known pattern. A social worker named Helen Ward recorded her observations carefully. Speech limited, vocabulary irregular, emotional response subdued. Most of the children didn't speak at all. Those who tried mixed words and sounds in ways no one could quite interpret. When Helen asked one boy who he lived with, he said, "Uncle Dad." She thought she'd misheard, so she repeated the question. The boy nodded. "Uncle Dad and Mum's sister." He smiled when he said it, proud of the answer, unaware of what it meant. Another child, a girl around 13, was more talkative. When Helen asked if she knew what school was, the girl tilted her head. "Is that the place you go when you do bad things?" she asked. Helen shook her head gently. "No, sweetheart. School is where you learn things," the girl frowned. "We learn things. Mum teaches us. Fire, water, animals. Case file entry by Ward H. Read. Note. Children display no concept of formal education, money, or broader society. Orientation limited to camp life. During an art exercise, the children were asked to draw their homes. Every page showed the same thing: huts, smoke, fires, and animals. No cars, no buildings, no people outside the family. One girl drew a tall figure at the center of her page. When asked who it was, she said, "The one who tells us the rules." Psychologists noticed that none of the drawings included doors. Speech therapists joined the sessions soon after. They described the children's communication as a mix of mimicry and invention. Some grunted instead of answering, others hummed to themselves in repetitive patterns. The younger ones followed the older ones' cues, glancing at them for approval before speaking. When one child was offered a toy car, he turned it upside down and traced the wheels with his fingers. "What does it do?" he asked. "It drives," Helen explained. "People use it to go places." The boy was confused. Why go places? It was the same with everything. Time, distance, even the concept of tomorrow meant nothing to them. Their world had been small, circular, and absolute. In a later report, Helen wrote, "They don't seem damaged by cruelty, but by absence of choice, language, and understanding." On the final day of initial assessments, the 13-year-old girl returned to the table with her drawing. She pointed to the line of trees she'd sketched around the huts and asked quietly, "Does everyone else live this way too?" Helen didn't know how to answer. To the Colt children, the world beyond that fence wasn't freedom. It was a rumor. The raid began before sunrise. The convoy lined up along the ridge, 4 police vehicles and 2 welfare vans. Engines idled, radios checked, doors shut quietly. From above, a single helicopter circled once, then hovered, blades stirring the early light. Senior Constable Harris gave the order just after 6. "We move in slow," he said. No shouting, no surprises. The vehicles rolled forward, tires crunching over dry gravel until the track disappeared entirely. The rest they covered on foot. The first glimpse of the camp came with smoke from a small fire and the shape of tin walls hidden behind trees. At the edge of the clearing, a little boy appeared. Barefoot, shirt torn, eyes blank. He didn't run or call for help. He simply stood there watching. Harris lifted his hand in a calm wave. "Morning, mate," he said softly. "We're here to check everyone's okay." The boy blinked once, then turned toward the shacks. More figures began to emerge. Children, women, a few older men. No one spoke. No one seemed surprised. Inside the shelters, officers found beds made from rags, tin plates half filled with stale bread, and rainwater collected in rusted buckets. The smell of smoke and damp clothes clung to the air. A welfare officer knelt beside a little girl holding a piece of string like a toy. "Can I see that?" she asked gently. The child shook her head. "Mum says not to talk to strangers." Another officer opened a small notebook to take notes. The first line he wrote was simple: "No sign of resistance. Emotional effect flat." Harris signaled for the welfare team to begin. "Start moving them to the vans. Children first." The adults stood still, offering no help, no argument. Betty Colt was among them. She sat on a crate, hands folded, eyes steady. When Harris approached, she said calmly, "They're my family." "Don't take them," he answered quietly. "They'll be safe, ma'am. That's all we want." "They already were," she replied. As the officers guided the children toward the vehicles, some clung to each other, refusing to be separated. One little boy held a tin cup to his chest. When an officer offered him water, he asked, "Do we have to give it back?" Another child looked up at the sky for the first time, squinting. "Can we come back before dark?" she whispered. By 9 o'clock, 12 children had been removed from the property. The rest were accounted for and scheduled for medical examination. Harris made his final note in the log: no aggression, no fear, only confusion. When the last van pulled away, the camp was silent again. Shacks still standing, smoke rising gently through the trees. They didn't ask where they were being taken, only if they could come back before dark. The interviews began 2 days after the raid. Each child was brought into a plain room with a table, 2 chairs, and a quiet voice waiting across from them. The goal wasn't interrogation. It was understanding, but the words that came back felt less like memories and more like rehearsed lines. A young boy was asked who his mother was. He frowned, thinking hard before answering, "Mum's mum." When the officer asked if he meant his grandmother, he shook his head. "No, Mum's mum." The boy smiled faintly, proud of the answer. Another child said his father was Uncle Dad. A third called her mother Sister Aunt. None of them hesitated. To them, these names made perfect sense. One officer later wrote, "The children spoke as if their language belonged to another world, one where words like mother, uncle, and sister meant something else entirely." When a 13-year-old girl was asked about school, she said she had never been. "Mum said we don't need it," she explained. "She teaches us herself." The officer asked what kind of things her mother taught. The girl's tone didn't change when she replied, "How to stay clean, how to keep blood pure." Each conversation circled back to the same phrases. "We don't talk about that. Mum says it's fine." No one raised their voice. No one seemed afraid. They spoke with the calm confidence of children, repeating lessons they'd memorized. A psychologist, observing through the glass, noted quietly that it was learned helplessness. The children didn't fight or question. They simply accepted. One boy refused to speak at all until the officer mentioned Betty's name. Then his eyes lit up. "Mum says it's fine," he whispered. "She said they'll never understand." By the 3rd day, patterns began to form. Every child gave the same timeline, the same rules, the same understanding of the world. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. One of the younger girls mentioned a book her mother kept beside her bed. "She writes in it at night," the girl said. "Who belongs to who? Who gets babies? Who's clean?" The note from that session read, "Possible family record," consistent with hierarchical control. When the officers questioned the adults later, they found no contradictions. Betty's older children repeated her words almost perfectly. "We look after our own. The world's poison. No one will ever understand." By the end of the week, the interviews had blurred together. Different voices, same phrases, same silences. The children weren't lying. They simply didn't know any other truth to tell. The final report from the psychological team summed it up in one line. Subjects display unified speech patterns indicative of conditioning, not confusion. They spoke like rehearsed actors, each line memorized, each silence earned. It was discovered during a property search, tucked beneath a rusted tin bed frame inside one of the larger shelters. A notebook, leather-bound, stained, its pages thick with dust and fingerprints. Someone had tried to hide it, but not well enough. When investigators opened it, they realized it wasn't a diary. It was an archive. Every page was written in the same hand, small, neat, and deliberate. The first entry dated back more than 30 years. At the top of the page, a single phrase was underlined twice. "The circle must stay clean." Beneath it were columns of names, first names only, linked by arrows, symbols, and dates. They weren't family trees, they were pairings. A forensic analyst flipped through the pages slowly, stopping at one entry that read, "Bobby with M child due after frost." Another section listed household rules, who prepared food, who collected water, who slept in which shelter. Alongside those lists were punishments, denials of meals, isolation, silence. The note attached to the evidence file read, "Ledger appears to combine genealogy, doctrine, and household management. Serves as control mechanism rather than record." As investigators translated the entries into a digital chart, the same names began looping back on themselves. The daughter's name appeared beside her brother's, then later beside her own son's. Every generation folded inward, following the same written logic: keep the circle clean. Dr. Morris, the geneticist who had handled the DNA analysis, was shown a copy of the book. "This explains the pattern," she said quietly. "It's not random. It's rule-bound." One officer who reviewed the ledger later wrote, "There's no sense of guilt in the writing, only structure. Every instruction is written as though it were law." In the back of the notebook, separate pages listed phrases and verses, half religious, half invented. "Blood, family makes truth. Outsiders destroy." It read less like guidance and more like belief. A child's handwriting appeared once near the bottom of a page. Next to a crudely drawn circle were the words, "We don't break the line." Investigators believed Betty Colt had allowed the children to copy phrases from the book as part of their lessons. When the ledger was presented during internal briefings, the reaction was quiet disbelief. One officer leaned back in his chair and said, "She built a religion out of incest." The report that followed described the book as a written manifesto of genetic isolation and moral inversion. It detailed everything: births, deaths, chores, punishments, and unions that defied law but followed her doctrine. The handwriting never changed. The authority never shifted. When questioned later about it, Betty Colt admitted the book was hers. "It keeps the order," she said. "It reminds them who we are." The statement was added to her file under the section marked Belief System. By the time analysts finished cataloging every page, they had no doubt what it represented. It wasn't a diary. It was scripture. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized the Colt settlement was only one branch of something larger. DNA cross-checks began linking individuals to names that didn't appear in the original files. People scattered across New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. At first, analysts thought the results were contamination. The markers overlapped too closely to belong to separate families, but repeated testing confirmed it. The Colts had spread their pattern across 3 states. The discovery started with a single sample from a child rescued in the raid. His DNA matched not just his immediate relatives, but cousins living hundreds of kilometers away under different surnames. That connection opened a chain of hidden histories, relatives who had moved, remarried, or vanished entirely. One report read, "Interstate kinship confirmed through autosomal comparison." Subjects likely relocated repeatedly over decades to avoid detection. Old welfare records supported the finding. In 1984, a family using the name Colton had been reported living near Renmark, South Australia. A decade later, a similar group appeared on the outskirts of Mildura, Victoria. Each time they left without warning when authorities grew curious. A retired local officer from that region remembered them. They were polite, quiet, always paid in cash, he said. They'd stay 6 months, then disappear overnight. Investigators compiled timelines and realized a consistent pattern. Every time a welfare inquiry or school enrollment flagged attention, the family would move deeper into isolation. Sometimes they shifted a few miles, sometimes hundreds. But they always reappeared under new names, starting over with the same structure and the same rules. The new genetic mapping confirmed at least 4 active generations linked by overlapping clusters. The chart looked more like a tangle than a tree, lines crossing state borders like migration routes. One analyst described it as a web with no center, only connections feeding back into itself. As data accumulated, it became clear that the original property wasn't their beginning. It was their latest hiding place. Locals in rural Victoria spoke of an older camp, long abandoned, where fires once burned through winter nights. They called it the first camp, the term Betty herself had written in her ledger. The pattern of movement was deliberate. Each relocation allowed the family to reset their secrecy. New councils, new neighbors, no records to follow. When suspicion rose, they packed everything they owned and vanished. An internal report summarized it simply. The Colt family operated as a migratory subculture of isolation. Their anonymity relied on constant movement and fragmentation of identity. By the time authorities traced every known branch, dozens of properties were under review. Farms, sheds, and makeshift dwellings hidden by bushland. None contained formal documentation. The network wasn't organized through communication. It was maintained through belief, an inherited instruction passed down like a family prayer. Stay hidden, stay together, stay clean. Every time the world got close, the Colts packed their silence and moved deeper into the trees. The leak came before anyone was ready. A single photograph from the police files, grainy, half-lit but unmistakable, appeared on a late-night news blog. Within hours, it was everywhere. By morning, headlines called it Australia's Hidden Valley. Networks replayed the same images on a loop, tents collapsing under rust, barefoot children in the dirt, and the blurred outline of a woman who would soon become the face of the story. Betty Colt. Reporters flooded the small towns surrounding the property, knocking on doors, chasing anyone who might have seen the family. One headline read, "Incest clan discovered in Nestala's bushland." Another called it a village of silence. Neighbors who had once traded groceries or fuel with the Colts now denied knowing them. A local shopkeeper told a camera crew, "They were quiet, strange but harmless. I never thought it was like this." Within days, the story turned from shock to outrage. Talk shows debated how a family could vanish from systems meant to protect children. Politicians promised inquiries. Comment sections filled with words like monsters, animals, failures. The same morning, the national broadcaster aired a segment titled "The Family Australia Forgot." Social services received over 1,000 calls demanding accountability. One commentator said, "This isn't just about one family. This is about the systems that let them disappear." Betty Colt had gone into hiding by then. For 3 weeks, she evaded authorities, moving between rural properties owned by distant relatives. When police finally found her, she didn't resist. She opened the door calmly and said, "I knew you'd come. You always do when it's too late." Her arrest was televised live. Footage showed her stepping into the police vehicle, expression blank, hands folded in her lap. There was no spectacle, just the quiet fall of someone who believed she'd done nothing wrong. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered holding signs that read, "Protect the children and justice for the forgotten." Inside, lawyers argued over jurisdiction, privacy, and suppression orders. The government called an emergency review of child protection protocols across multiple states. An internal statement from the Welfare Department read, "The Colt case represents an unprecedented failure of interagency coordination and oversight." The same night, a primetime anchor looked into the camera and asked, "How many more families are out there hidden in plain sight?" Public interest was immediate, but compassion was scarce. Online forums turned the Colts into a symbol of decay, a talking point rather than a tragedy. For weeks, the story dominated national headlines before fading into the background noise of newer scandals and newer fears. But the image of that camp of those children stayed. The family that had lived unseen for generations was now seen by everyone, and no one wanted to look twice. The hearings began behind closed doors under a full suppression order. No cameras, no public gallery, just a courtroom filled with lawyers, psychologists, and the remnants of a family that no longer understood what family meant. 8 adults sat at the defense table, Betty Colt among them. Across from her, the prosecution laid out a timeline that spanned decades, entire generations of secrecy and control. The first days focused on establishing identity. Even that proved difficult. Birth records were incomplete, names inconsistent. One clerk whispered, "We can't even prove who's related to whom without DNA." The presiding judge leaned forward, reading from the case file. "We are dealing with relationships so entangled," she said, "that traditional definitions of parent, child, and sibling no longer apply." The court heard testimonies from psychologists who described what they called institutionalized ignorance, a condition where the victims could no longer separate care from abuse or love from control. One report read, "Consent is meaningless in a world where no one knows another choice exists." When prosecutors questioned Betty about the family structure, she remained calm. "They're mine," she said simply. "I raised them right. We hurt no one." The lawyer pressed, asking if she understood the law she had broken. Betty's response was almost patient. "The law out there isn't the same as ours." Her words set the tone for the rest of the trial. Some of the adult children now in state care were called to testify. One young woman said she wanted to go home. "It's where I belong," she told the court. "Mum looked after us. The world doesn't." Another broke down mid-sentence, unable to explain what wrong even meant. The defense argued diminished responsibility, insisting the family's isolation made comprehension of legal and moral boundaries impossible. "They did not hide to deceive," counsel said. "They hid because they didn't understand the outside existed." The prosecution countered that ignorance could not erase harm. Every generation suffered because the last one refused to see beyond itself, the lead prosecutor said. "That is not innocence. That is willful blindness." Judges and jurors struggled to define where culpability began, who was victim, who was perpetrator, and who was simply born into a cage built by belief. During closing arguments, one magistrate remarked, "The law recognizes acts of neglect and abuse, but this case reaches beyond that. It is the collapse of a system that allowed silence to become inheritance." Verdicts were read quietly. Some were convicted of incest and neglect. Others were referred to psychiatric care. None seemed to fully understand what the decisions meant. When the proceedings ended, the room fell silent. No one celebrated. There was no closure, only the weight of what had been revealed. The courtroom had words for assault and neglect, but not for inheritance of silence. After the trial, the Colt children were placed in foster care across several towns. Social workers hoped distance would help them rebuild. It didn't happen easily. Siblings were separated for the first time in their lives. Some screamed when they were moved into new homes. Others went silent for days. One child refused to sleep unless he could see his sister. When a foster parent tried to explain they would visit soon, he whispered, "She gets scared without me." Therapists worked in rotation, documenting every reaction. One note read, "Attachment disorder severe. Dependency between siblings indistinguishable from survival instinct." At meal times, many waited for permission to eat. One foster mother said, "They sit there staring at the plate until I nod. Even then, they watch me first, like they're checking if it's safe." In therapy sessions, progress came slowly. A teenage girl asked her counselor if home was fixed yet. When told they wouldn't be going back, she frowned. "But Mum said that's where good people live." The counselor replied gently, "Your mother was wrong." The girl shook her head. "She's never wrong." It was the same in almost every case, loyalty woven into trauma, affection tangled with fear. Therapists called it cognitive dissonance through conditioning. The children didn't hate their abusers. They missed them. One therapist wrote, "They speak about punishment with the same tone they use for love. Their memories don't separate pain from comfort." For the younger ones, the world outside the valley was a shock. Automatic doors made them flinch. Running water terrified them. A little boy cried when a light switch turned off. "It takes the day away," he said quietly. School proved harder. Most couldn't sit still for lessons. The idea of routine without command was foreign. Teachers reported blank stares, delayed responses, and a fear of being praised. One teacher said, "They look confused when you tell them they did well, like they're waiting for a trick." But over time, a few began to adapt. One girl learned to write her name for the first time. A boy joined a soccer team and smiled when his teammates shouted his name. Those small shifts became victories the staff measured carefully. Even so, progress never erased the past. Some asked to return to the camp. They said it was quieter there, easier to understand. A psychologist summarized the dilemma bluntly. They associate freedom with danger because captivity felt like love. Years later, some of the children continued therapy under new names and new identities. Others still lived under supervision. None forgot the valley. For them, the world beyond it was strange, loud, unpredictable. And though they were free, few could explain what that meant. Freedom meant nothing to those who never knew they were prisoners. The final interview with Betty Colt took place 2 weeks before her sentencing. She entered the room calmly, wrists cuffed, her posture as straight as ever. When the recorder clicked on, she smiled faintly and said, "You've all got it wrong, you know." The investigator across from her didn't respond. He simply asked her to explain. Betty folded her hands. "They keep saying we're broken, but we're not. We're just close. God made families to stay together. That's all we did, stayed together." Her voice never trembled. It was steady, almost soothing. The investigator noted the tone in his file, writing, "No sign of remorse. Rationalization appears absolute." When asked about the children, she nodded as if she were being complimented. "They're good children," she said. "Obedient, kind. The world should be proud of them." The interviewer pressed her gently. "Do you understand that what happened was against the law?" Betty tilted her head. "The law changes every time the world forgets what family means. But the truth doesn't change." For a moment, she looked almost offended by the question. "You call it crime. I call it closeness. God's plan for keeping people pure." She leaned forward slightly. "You people make things dirty. You separate what should never be separated." Her words were quiet, but the conviction behind them was solid. There was no confusion in her eyes, only certainty. The investigator tried again, asking if she understood the damage done to her children. Betty frowned. "You talk about damage," she said, "but they were happy. They sang, they helped, they knew who they were. Out there, you don't even know your neighbor's name." The note from that session read, "Subject displays complete moral inversion. Belief system intact. Emotional detachment total." When the interview shifted toward her future, Betty shrugged. "They'll lock me up," she said, "but that doesn't matter. The line is still clean. They'll remember what I taught them." The investigator asked what she meant by that. She smiled. "You can't unteach truth." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Betty didn't break it. She stared at the wall, blinking slowly, as if replaying memories only she understood. At the end of the session, when the officer thanked her for cooperating, she looked up and said her final recorded words. "We were never lost," she said softly. "You were." Later, the investigator added one last line to his report. She did not confess, apologize, or acknowledge harm. Her silence held the weight of belief, not guilt. When the door closed behind her, no one spoke for a long time. Her silence spoke louder than any confession. Years later, the valley stood empty. The dirt track that once led to the Colt settlement was barely visible on satellite images, just a faint scar of lighter soil winding through the trees. The huts had collapsed. The tarps were gone. Wind and time had erased what little remained of the place that had hidden 5 generations. The government fenced the land off at first, marking it as private property under state control. But no one wanted it. Local real estate agents tried to list it 3 times. Every sale fell through. One potential buyer walked the perimeter and left without finishing the inspection. "It doesn't feel right," he said. "Like something's still here." The property stayed abandoned, overgrown and silent. Meanwhile, the surviving members of the Colt family built new lives, at least the ones who could. Many lived under new names. Some went through years of therapy. Others refused it. Psychologists followed their progress quietly, tracking what they called echoes of conditioning. One therapist wrote, "Even after years of exposure to ordinary life, subjects display instinctive submission to authority and confusion around family boundaries. A few of the children grew into adulthood, carrying the same strange mix of affection and fear when speaking about their past. One said, 'Sometimes I miss it there, not what happened, just knowing what every day was.' Another admitted she still slept with the light on, afraid of silence. For most of them, recovery didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to live beside memory instead of inside it. Welfare officers who had worked the original case were transferred or retired. Some never spoke publicly again. One of them was quoted years later saying, "That family taught me something I didn't want to know, that if you hide long enough, the world stops looking." The Colt land eventually became a symbol in government reviews, used in training sessions for child protection officers. Photos of the site appeared on presentation slides, labeled only Case 1247. The faces were blurred, the names redacted, but the story never really disappeared. Every few years, new journalists tried to revisit it, calling it a national scar, a story that still didn't fit cleanly into blame or redemption. Each time, the same question came back. How could it happen, and how many others had slipped through the same cracks? An investigator who had led the initial raid drove past the area once, long after retiring. The bush had swallowed the road entirely. "It's like the land wanted to forget," he said. "And maybe that's mercy." The Colt story ended where it began, in silence, in the space between what people saw and what they chose to ignore. The families moved on, the headlines faded, but the questions stayed. The valley forgot the Colts, but Australia never will. The Colt case wasn't just a story of isolation. It was a mirror, showing what happens when neglect hides behind silence, and when generations live by rules the world stopped enforcing. Even now, that valley lies empty. But the questions it left behind still echo through every forgotten road, every broken system, every child who slips through the cracks. If stories like this remind you how easily the unthinkable can hide in plain sight, make sure to like this video, subscribe to X Archives and turn on notifications so you never miss the truths history tried to bury. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from, your city, your local time, and your thoughts about this case, because the world may have forgotten the Colt family. But as long as we keep talking about them, their silence never wins.